Hi everyone, Shelley here. Today I'm going to explain the fat over lean rule and how it works with my underpainting process, which I use with walnut oil to start, and I apply it in a super thin coat, and then that's followed with the use of a thin layer of a transparent oil paint. Here I'm using transparent oxide red. So what does fat over lean mean? Richard Schmidt in his book Alla Prima 2 explains it as progressing from thin paint to thicker paint. And what he means by thicker paint is just simply paint straight from the paint tube, nothing else added. In the book Portrait Painting Atelier, Suzanne Brooker states, paint that is already buttery in consistency right out of the tube can be thinly applied to create a lean layer. In addition, thick layers should be applied over thinly applied layers, and slow drying paint should be applied over fast drying paint. These both follow the fat over lean rule of thumb. And in the book Classical Painting Atelier, it says, when an underpainting is well executed, it can provide a unified blueprint for a finished work. It should be lighter and more transparent than the later applications of paint. Underpainting layers are designed to be visible in a finished work, and they may provide the shadow tone in dark areas. So let me break it down for you a little further and in my own words. So oil-based underpaintings, in particular walnut oil, was widely used by artists of the European Renaissance. One in particular comes to mind, Leonardo da Vinci, who was around in 1452 to 1519. And you'll know him best for his painting of the Mona Lisa. And also Giorgio Vasari, who followed Leonardo. He was here in 1511 through 1574 and is known for the Patience Isaiah painting. Okay, so why use walnut oil? It is lighter and easier to work with than linseed oil, which was more popular and more common. But walnut oil does not oxidize as quickly as linseed oil, so you get a few more days to complete and perfect your composition as compared to the few hours that you would get with linseed oil. Walnut oil has less of a yellowing effect than linseed oil. I found a very interesting study written in Wet Canvas. It's a chart describing the yellowing of mediums. So here you can see all the different oils, and in particular the walnut oil, and this chart was made and then put in indirect sunlight for 1.5 years and allowed to process. So the first layer you're seeing is a little bit of white paint with the oil. The blue layer is a little bit of blue and white paint topped with the oil, and then the bottom layer is a little bit of oil put right on top of just the ground, the gesso acrylic ground. And you can see that walnut oil does not yellow as compared to the more commonly found linseed oil. I found that very interesting. I will be sure to leave a link to that study in the description so you can go there if you want to read more about it. So I initially learned this method of doing an underpainting from my mentor, Tina Garrett, she learned it from Richard Schmidt, and you can find more about that process in his book, Alla Prima 2. There's a link in the description for his book. Now, Richard Schmidt learned this technique from his teacher, Bill Mosby, and so on and so forth. So this technique of using this thin layer of walnut oil with the transparent paint dates way back to the Renaissance time, like I said. So it's been used in practice and in theory for hundreds of years, and all of these paintings are holding up very successfully. Okay, I know some of you are thinking, but you want to use an odorless mineral spirits as a thinner initially. Well, here's what I found. Thinner is not technically part of the medium family. Too much thinner disperses the polymers too broadly to effectively bond the pigment, and forms weak, porous coats or layers. So in using an odorless mineral spirit to thin your paint during the underpainting process, you're going to get very thin, almost like a watercolor wash of transparent color. This is not good if you plan to let some of the darker shadow areas show through in the final painting, which is what is recommended and for this process, and it's also one of the reasons why I choose to use this process. Using walnut oil will give you a thin but glossy, rich color in those shadow areas. Just be sure to use the smallest amount of walnut oil in this initial stage. Also, I just wanted to mention the whole reason that I got to thinking about this is I received a comment from Stephen M. and he asked, doesn't this violate the fat over lean rule? So I responded to the comment, but I was thinking after I did so that maybe a more in-depth discussion on this topic would help him, Stephen, and others like Stephen maybe understand that this process does stay within the confines of that fat over lean rule and has been used for hundreds of years successfully. Now, I believe that part of the reason this works so well with my process is that I'm most often using an oil primed canvas. So while oil primer is the best choice with this practice of underpainting using the walnut oil, acrylic gesso may also be used. Again, just be sure the walnut oil is very thin. The use of soupy oil washes does date back to the 1800s, and their paintings have held up perfectly for hundreds of years. But more than likely, this is due to the use of an oil ground. Acrylic grounds didn't even come about until around the 1950s. So I feel like it's best to stick with one medium in a painting. I really don't use mediums. You're going to only see me using the walnut oil as necessary. But truly, after the underpainting is done and is dry, I'm going back on top of that with just paint straight from the tube. Now here's my thinking on that. Many of the fine oil paints are made using walnut oil as their binder. Therefore, it makes sense to start with it. Remember, just think, thick over thin equals fat over lean. So when you're not using a bunch of different types of fast drying or slow drying paints or different mediums to help with the drying time or the smoothness or thickness of the paint, and you're sticking with just an oil, hopefully walnut oil, then the thick over thin equals fat over lean. And just for your information, there is a paint company that I really like, M. Graham and Company. Their binder is walnut oil, and their paints are really very nice. They use a large degree of pigment and then the walnut oil to bind. So the recipe for an oil paint is oil plus pigment. That's traditionally all that ever needed to be in a good oil paint. Now, there are student grade and lesser quality paints, and what happens is the type and amount of pigment is decreased, and then they add things like stabilizers, fillers, dryers. So when you're buying a more quality paint, doesn't necessarily mean it's more expensive, but it can be. But a better quality paint is going to have more pigment and a higher quality oil as the binder. So just keep that in mind and you should be fine. Don't worry about using a bunch of different mediums. If you want to experiment, don't do it on one of your more finished fine art pieces that you really want to create to have some longevity. If you want to test mediums out and try different ways of painting with them, do it on a test canvas. So thank you so much, Stephen M., for putting that question to my mind and letting me get in here and really, hopefully, clarify some of the mystery in that fat over lean thinking. Now, I gotta say, this is one of my go-to starting processes. I love doing an underpainting this way. Now, often I'll use the transparent red oxide. Sometimes I'll mix it up and switch over to the transparent brown oxide, or I'll blend a little bit of Viridian in with the transparent brown oxide if I don't want it to be too red. But generally you want to stick with these earth tone type paints for your underpainting. I have tried in the past some other colors. One in particular comes to mind that I will never use again, and that was blue. It was quite a struggle. I ended up getting where I needed to be in the finished piece, but it was not easy. It took quite a lot of efforts of playing with paint colors on top of that blue. I have definitely found with experience the earth tones and the browns and the reds really allow you to have a better painting experience on the final color end of things. But the whole point of the underpainting, as I mentioned before, is to get a good composition down and focus on your values, putting in the values where you want them to be. That's going to give you the most greatest effect of 3D, especially if it's a portrait where it's close up to the head. You really want to get in some of that 3D effect. Really focus on getting that down in your underpainting, and then when you go back with your colors on top of the dried underpainting, you're not going to struggle. So who's struggling with underpaintings or still has questions about how to do an underpainting properly? Well, if that's you, then I have the answers for you. And best of all, it's free. So you just go to my Expressive Portraits in Oils. I'll leave a link. You'll see it here, 3 ways to start a portrait painting. And here's a peek into what you can expect in the 3 ways to start a portrait painting. Welcome to starting method number 2, underpainting. Master painters like Bouguereau and Vermeer have used underpaintings. They even let the underpainting show through in the shadow areas of their portraits. In today's workshop, I'm going to show you the steps that I took to complete this underpainting of Emeline. We'll start by lightly wiping down our canvas with a little bit of walnut oil on a cloth. Discard any oil-soaked rags into a container with water. We'll be using transparent oxide brown oil paint. I recommend using a soft-haired brush. Use a kneaded eraser or Q-tips to remove paint. So have no fear while you're painting. Everything is fixable. Nothing's permanent. And there's no worries because you have a couple of days to move things around and edit as needed. Really, the main thing to remember when you're doing an underpainting, the purpose of it is to find the correct placement of your features and capture the likeness early on of your subject, and to pay attention to values. So position of details and values, those are the 2 main things that you are concentrating on while painting your underpainting. Because once you have those solidified, then you let the underpainting dry to the touch, and now you can come back on top of it with your full color, and you don't have to worry about measuring and thinking about value, other than matching the value of your underpainting to the colored brushstroke that you're laying on top of it. You want to keep your underpainting pretty thin. If you lay down any bits of paint that tend to raise or lay a little chunky on the canvas, just knock those back lightly with a fan brush. For features like the mouth, I like to go ahead and find several points and then paint in that feature. You can see here that I'm demonstrating that technique. It just makes painting in the feature a little more free, a little less cumbersome of having to stop and make all those measurements before I can continue. This works better for an area like the mouth. It's a little more loose. Squinting is helpful to see the values in your reference material, so you can squint at your computer screen or your printout, and it'll really help solidify whether what you're painting is a dark value, a middle value, or a light value. And now we're going to go into the side area of the head where you see that flower, and when you're working in a darker area and you want to remove paint, You just use your kneaded eraser. You can squeeze that into any shape so it works well. And Q-tips work great, or if you need something a little bigger, you could use a squished up paper towel or a cloth, old t-shirts. And once you've got some nice paint down, you want to lightly brush across that with your fan brush. You want your underpainting to end up being smooth, so if you do paint on top of it, the paint's going to go on a nice smooth surface. You don't want bumpy ridges of paint. You don't want to be able to feel the brush strokes that you've laid down. Really focus on putting in any little more details that I feel I want to show in the underpainting. Okay, when it's finished, you just let it dry for a couple days and then you are ready to paint on top of that or let it stand as a beautiful work of art on its own. So I hope you guys will share this video and pass it along to any of your artist friends that you think would benefit from my free video, 3 ways to start a portrait painting. And it can be found at sjcportraitcourse.com. I'll be sure to put the link in the description. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.